All right, Zach. So today I thought it would be fun to kind of give a good education about appraisals, which people are probably like, hey, you're a real estate agent in Utah, and Zach, you're a lender in Utah. Like, what are you guys doing talking about appraisals? But it 100% affects what we do when we're helping buyers, right? So, just to start us off, would you be so kind as to give us a definition of an appraisal? Like, what is an appraisal?
Yeah, an appraisal is essentially a third party that comes in and just makes sure that the value of the asset is where it should be, relative to the purchase price and based off what the lender's going to be giving in money. They're kind of just that third pair of eyes to say, okay, nobody's buying something that isn't worth what it really is.
Yeah, and it's like a fail safe. It's supposed to protect both the bank and the buyer, right? Because nobody wants to pay more than what a property is worth. So that's the idea behind it. That's what they're trying to accomplish. Um, so it's interesting because I think people's main concern, a lot of the times, I see a lot of stress and anxiety about an appraisal coming in low. So let's just kind of talk about, well, why would an appraisal come in low? And so what have you seen? Like, when have you seen an appraisal come in low? What was an example of like maybe when an appraisal came in low?
Yeah, so in the Harriman area, we had one recently where it was like a 2,000 square foot house, but he had built a four-car garage in back of the house. So in total, it was a six-car garage house.
Yeah,
Well, there's not a lot of 2,000 square foot homes that have six-car garages, right?
yeah,
And so, like, anytime there's kind of a uniqueness to the property, it just gives there a little bit of like nuance to that one where we might see an appraisal come in different than where they might have it at in terms of value, just because there's not a lot to compare it to. So,
yeah. That's valid. Something that just happened to me. First of all, I have to say, within the last like maybe 3, 4 years, have not run into appraisals coming in low, except for this one scenario that I'm going to share. But generally speaking, the appraisers are being a little bit generous, allowing the buyers to wrap in a lot of closing costs so they can buy down their rate. That you're seeing a lot of that. They're being a little bit more flexible, and they're like, okay, we'll let you kind of push the value a little bit because you need. I mean, I've seen like $30,000 negotiation so that they
right.
can buy down the rate and pay their closing costs. So it's a pretty hefty buffer. But that would be a reason where that maybe as we move into spring and values are changing and stuff, they might disagree with that. I guess we'll have to see. But what I ran into was just a nasty appraiser for no reason at all. Like, and he's like, I'm an experienced appraiser. I have a million years in appraisal experience. And but he came in, we had their little bountiful house totally under contract. Buyers were happy, sellers were happy, and he just like legitimately he just I can't, I think it was 35,000 low, 35,000 or 40,000 low, which was absolutely and completely insane. And we were very, I know my values. And so, they say, oh, well, you can renegotiate. You can ask for a second appraisal, or you can ask the appraiser to change their mind or give them evidence. So it was really interesting because it took us a while to try and figure out why in the world did this come in low. Because when I sent him the comparables, like this is what I based the price on of this home, he came back and said, well, those are the ones that I used. And I thought, there's no way. I'm looking at my sheet and how it came out, and then his appraisal. And what we realized is that he manipulated it. He like lowered the value. And I was like, based on what? Why are you manipulating this value? But the appraisers have the ability to do that. Like we entrust them to like, so let's say that the house was not remodeled at all. He can lower that if he's comparing it against homes that are remodeled. That's justifiable. But that was not the case. So unfortunately, what ended up happening to that cute little house in Bountiful, Utah, is that the buyers, I mean, the sellers stayed firm and they said, we're not able to meet this appraisal value, and so the buyers had to cancel, and we had to get a new buyer. But our new buyer was able to purchase it, and the appraisal came in at that actual value that we were negotiating for. So sometimes, unfortunately, you get a stinker of an appraiser who just doesn't feel like, I don't know what's going on in their personal life. I mean, I don't know what happened, but I like to tell myself no one's that cruel just for fun. Something's going on. Someone's doing something mean to him and he's just pushing it forward. Who knows? But sometimes that happens. Um, and as market shifts, like there was a point in time when we were in that COVID era and everyone was paying cash over appraisal. Like you hardly even paid attention to appraisal because it was like, sure, you can say whatever you want, but in our actual contract, our actual agreement, we're agreeing to pay X amount of dollars over appraisal. So it was a really insane market shift. And that's changed, I think, the whole appraisal dynamic a lot. And they actually even called them emotional appraisals. And so sometimes if something's a negotiation is going funky, they'll say, oh, this is a really emotional appraisal, which is interesting, but true because the actual definition of an appraisal is whatever a buyer is willing, like, will worth, not an appraisal, because an appraisal bases it on facts and stats, but value is whatever a buyer is willing to pay, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that's just, it is what it is. But what happens? What happens with a buyer if it doesn't appraise?
Well, it kind of gives a reset to the negotiations, right? So the buyer can then go back to the seller's agent and they typically furnish the report, right? The appraisal and say, hey, here's our appraisal. This is what it came in at. And sometimes we see them split the difference. Sometimes we see the seller come down in price to meet the appraisal. A lot depends on how the negotiations went previous to the appraisal coming in, right?
Yeah.
And kind of what the temperature is between the two parties. Um, or also the buyer can always just come in and make up the difference and bring in the cash to closing. And, we've seen that before, especially during COVID, right?
Yeah.
The appraisal came in and they just knew they were paying X amount for the property and they moved forward with it. So
Yeah.
another thing too is sometimes we can get different comparables, right? Like you said, is we can kind of go back to the appraiser and say, well, hey, I think you missed this comparable or that comparable, and kind of shed some more light as to why we think it's worth a specific value. Maybe something that the appraiser missed. Or one thing that I've had too recently, we had a couple different jumbos out in the Mapleton area. And whenever you're doing a jumbo, sometimes they'll let you get away with one appraisal, or sometimes they'll say, hey, we need to have one more appraiser go out there and make sure that it's really worth the value. And so sometimes it's just that, extra pair of eyes that they want from even the lender's perspective to say, no, is this home really worth, 2.5 million? Let's get multiple eyes on it to make sure that everybody's coming in with the same value.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and just to kind of give some perspective as with sellers as well, some creative financing that I've done, like I just had one where it wasn't the appraisal, it was more like what they were feeling as far as like inspection and there was a couple things going on and the sellers didn't have the room to be able to negotiate. So we decided to offer them the fridge, the washer, the dryer, and then they were like, "Ooh, we like that." They're like, "But not quite yet." And then we're like, "What if we left the master bedroom furniture like, and it worked. Like it worked because the buyers needed these things and so to them they were valuable. So once we got to the point where everyone felt like, yeah, that feels good, we were able to make it work with some creative, negotiation. And then also, a lot of times when there is like all a buyer will buffer in a lot of room. They, like we were referring to before, like here in Utah, sometimes you're buffering in 25,000, 30,000 that the buyer wants the seller to give back. So it's incorporated in the loan, but it's not going into, so they're giving an offer for 500,000, but it's really 470 because they want 30,000 back. But it's helpful to the buyer to buy down the rate and all the things. But for the seller, it's really hurting their bottom line. So sometimes we have had to go back and say, you did this huge buffer. Now we need you to remove some of this buffer. Like due to the appraisal, like now we can only give you 15 because the appraisal says we can't buffer 30 or whatever it might be. So there's things that you can do that way so that you can make sure that everybody wins and you keep the deal together. But I will say that appraisals do affect the negotiations. I always warn my clients that we have three different negotiations that happen when you're buying a house or selling, because the first negotiation is getting it under contract and coming to an agreement on the overview of the terms. Then when you have the inspection, you're renegotiating based on, like, is there anything that's non-functional? Is there anything that is a safety issue? And then you're renegotiating that. And then you're negotiating again when the appraisal comes in. So there are some negotiation points that are really important, and the appraisal being one of them, right?
Right.
So that's kind of how it goes with the appraisal negotiation. And then just kind of to wrap things up, tell me a little bit, like, from your perspective, there's been a lot of pressure on the mortgage industry and interest rates. And so what are you seeing as some of the bigger financing challenges, and what are you seeing with rates?
Yeah, so biggest challenges I'm seeing right now are rates have finally come down into a pretty decent. We're kind of in that low sixes, high fives range, which is fantastic. Um, as far as that goes, we're likely going to see interest rates kind of continue to do this gradual decline. We have a new Fed chairman that's going to get picked by President Trump, and he's likely going to be releasing that name in January, is what we're hearing. And so that'll be helpful as far as just, the changing out of Jerome Powell. And then we're also just seeing inflation continues to come lower month over month. And then we're also seeing oil prices come down, which just gives everybody, it's kind of a tailwind for us, right? When
Yep.
oil prices are coming down and gas is getting cheaper, we just know that ties into different aspects of inflation and just helps us. And so we feel like it's going to be a really good year in terms of when we go into the spring summer market. There's going to be a lot of buyers buying and just a lot of activity that we're going to be seeing this year.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just listened to, so Brian Buffini, I do coaching with him. I've been doing it for all 20 years that I'm been in real estate. And he has a whole department dedicated to research and looking at stats and figuring out the real estate market. And the prediction is for 2026 that our spring market is going to be hopping. It's going to be an actual, traditionally spring is a lot of real estate agents and lenders as well. Like, we could have a bulk of our income happen in a spring part of the year, because there's more people that are, that timing for them is better. But it hasn't been that way. The last couple of years have been very very all over the place, but he's saying get ready because things are going to start warming up, which means we've had this cooler market. It's been kind of steady the last few years, but I suspect that due to everything that he was talking about, is that you're going to have a lot more people making moves. Rates are coming down. So, we've had 25% of potential buyers and sellers just waiting on the fence. Um, so it'll be interesting to see how that shakes down. But going back to appraisals, the interesting thing is that they do play a big part in the good negotiations, but there are creative ways to get around that. So I am really grateful to have a good team and to work with someone like the Asbel team that helps me and my buyers, like, as we're negotiating our way through these purchasing processes. But yeah, so I appreciate all of your insight on appraisal, and thanks so much. We appreciate you.
Awesome. Thanks, Janet.